Good, just barely afternoon. And welcome to the Ashland Library. Welcome to Windows in Time, a Century in the Big Applegate. This is the second second time we're giving this presentation every month, as I hope you know. The collaboration between the Southern Oregon Historical Society and the Jackson County Library Services brings us a local history talk once at the Medford Library the first Wednesday of the month, and again at the Ashland Library on the second Wednesday of the month. We're so glad to see such a great turnout today. I am Ellie Anderson. I work here at the Ashland Library, and I have a few just sort of welcoming and housekeeping remarks. First of all, if you happen to have a phone with you or anything else that might make a noise, please silence it so that we don't get interrupted. I do want to let you know that this presentation is being recorded today, and in a couple weeks it'll be available again on our Jackson County Library Services YouTube channel. So if anyone wants to watch it again or recommend it to a friend, that's an excellent option. And all of the previous Windows in Time, at least for the last few years, are available on the YouTube channel as well. So you can take a deep dive into local history there. One of my responsibilities is to read the Jackson County Library Services land acknowledgement, so we'll take a minute for that. Jackson County Library Services acknowledges that its libraries are located within the traditional lands of the Cow Creek Band of Umpqua Tribe of Indians and the Modoc Nation, as well as the Shasta, Takelma, and Lagawa people, whose descendants are now identified as members of the Confederated Tribes of Siletz Indians and the Confederated Tribes of Grand Ronde. We take this moment to recognize the Indigenous peoples whose traditional lands are where residents of Jackson County live today. JCLS is committed to fostering understanding, deep respect, and honor for Indigenous people, and we encourage you to learn more about the land you reside on. One way to do that is to visit jcls.org/land. I think that is that from me. I would like to introduce Alice Mulholland for some words about the Southern Oregon Historical Society.
Thank you. I always like to do this in Ashland. How many of you are members of the Southern Oregon Historical Society? If you aren't, you see you're in the minority, and you really should be. All you have to do to become a member is go to sohs.org online, and there's a membership section. Great. I'd like to introduce to you Amy Blossom now, who will introduce our speaker.
Today, we are welcoming Laura Ahearn, who moved to the Applegate Valley in 2017 after a career in environmental law and 17 years traveling the world on a sailboat. Might be a good talk, a little outside of our realm of the county, but she is the president of McKee Bridge Historical Society, a researcher, writer for the Society's Facebook page, curator of the virtual museum at www.mckeebridge.org, and a frequent author for local news magazines. She works diligently for the Friends of the Animals. She is on the Citizen Review Board, which I learned today is a board put on by the county that reviews foster care, and is active in a number of different political campaigns, so you may see her name come up. We welcome her today to learn a little bit about Applegate.
Well, good afternoon, and thanks for coming out. First, I am indebted to the descendants who have saved and shared photos, stories, and a few tall tales. Also, Jeff Lalande, Chelsea Rose, and Bren Truey, who have been academic advisors for McKee Bridge Historical Society on projects relevant to today's topic. Imagine waking in the pest house at Kanaka Flat during the smallpox epidemic. You cannot hear when your father is dead. Or maybe it is your mother who is gone, but your father is there. He is in charge of the pest house. Sophia and Martha are two of the Native American women at the core of Watkins, a community that flourished in Big Applegate for 100 years. Big Applegate was the southernmost stretch of the Applegate River. The land of the Dakapetete, Shasta and Takelma were also present. Early cartographers had a poor understanding of Applegate Creek. They traced it eastward towards some mines. In 1852, this was just diffuse prospecting by newcomers like Billy Dorn or J.J. Elliott. Contrast this cluttered Metzger's map 100 years later, labeled with people and events. Here is Billy Mountain, Elliott Creek. Heading upstream from McKee Bridge, you can see that the Applegate River flows from the south-southwest. This area is Big Applegate with Watkins at the base of Collins Mountain. And here's where our story starts, just west of Jacksonville. Kanaka Flat, also known as One Horse Town, and Forest Creek, more commonly known as Jackass Creek. Most Indigenous people who survived the Rogue Indian Wars were removed to reservations, but some stayed. Only a few are well known. You'll get to learn more. You'll get to know some more today. Let's start with Chick Chick, a Takelma woman. Mrs. Langley in the 1860 census for Forest Creek. Her husband, Edward J. Langley, immigrated from England in 1852 and headed directly to the gold fields. Note their neighbor, Charles Williams. Chick Chick and Ed had a son. Although the enumerator, William Henry Sweet Hyde, wrote this on August 7th, he was listing only those whose usual place of abode on the first day of June was with this family. So someone is missing. This is Martha Maria, born June 15th, 1860. Here was probably her son, James, and Martha Maria in the 1930s. 8 years after Martha's birth, smallpox gripped the area. Lindsay Applegate was the Indian subagent, and Hyde, now county clerk, wrote to Applegate on January 6, 1869. I am directed by the Board of Commissioners to inform you that the smallpox, which is now raging in our midst, has also alarmingly spread on Kanaka Flat. Several on the flat now have it, and it is feared it cannot be speedily checked. One died with the disease, the first person taken. Many of them must absolutely perish for want of suitable and timely aid. But that wasn't the county's job. I am therefore directed to solicit you as Indian agent to render that class such assistance as may be suitable and proper for them. They ought not perish for want of food or necessary clothing. Applegate sought orders from Oregon's Superintendent of Indian Affairs, who was also his nephew by marriage, John Webster Parrott Huntington. Collect them, vaccinate them, provide quarters and subsistence, be very economical. This was an urgent message. It came by telegraph through William M. Turner, the telegraph operator. Those familiar with Jacksonville landmarks can envision his White House at 120 North 5th Street. That's one block up from the old courthouse, now City Hall. Applegate was in Ashland and wasn't going anywhere near the contagion in Jacksonville. The first guy he turned to didn't turn out, so he turned to Turner. I assure you that when the proper time shall come, I will make a determined effort to break up that disgusting den of infamy on Kanaka Flat and will apply for orders to that effect. The correspondence and news reports are more inflammatory than what I'll recite today. The outsiders at Kanaka Flat were forbidden to enter Jacksonville. The dance house was converted to the pest house. Ed Langley was in charge of the pest house. Applegate's correspondence reflects horrific conditions, destitute women and children with no suitable clothing or blankets in freezing January. But by mid-February, the epidemic was easing. Turner wrote, "I apprehend that in about 2 weeks, all quarantine restrictions will be removed. These people can procure their own subsistence, with 1 or 2 exceptions, by labor until such time as you may see fit to otherwise dispose of them." Lindsay's son Oliver was lining up to become the subagent. Turner wrote to Oliver, "There seems to be a general desire among our best citizens to have you take them all away as soon as convenient." It was Lindsay Applegate who wrote back, "You no doubt are getting anxious to get rid of providing for and looking after the Indians in the vicinity of Jacksonville. And I wish also to get them away as soon as possible. Please inform them that I shall expect them to start for the Klamath Reservation in 2 days." Applegate wanted to know how many people he was ordering to move and if they had any means of travel. Turner provided a list of 60. Only 1 had a horse. So here is Ed Langley on Kanaka Flat with 3 children. Ed and Chichik had at least 2 sons, and Martha and his wife had died before the smallpox epidemic. Rogue River Woman with George Marshall on Jackass. All available evidence points to Celia, a Takelma with a tattooed chin like Grandma Aggie. Celia's complicated life warrants a Windows in Time all by itself. So we'll just focus on some of the evidence here that this is Celia. Alfred Law here would become her first husband in 1871. You can see he has 2 children already with an Umpqua woman. Within a year, Alfred would abandon Celia and leave those children, David and Alice Law, with her. Susie here is her sister with Evi Sebring. A very interesting episode occurs later at the home of a family who's actually with us here today when Celia's 3rd husband murders Evi Sebring. So we'll save that. That's going to be a tease. Come back for the next Windows in Time about Celia's life. Here we have Betsy, child and sister. A Shasta, called both Betsy or Bessie. She'd come to Kanaka Flat from Hornbrook with her white husband, Fred Lewis, and their daughter, Sophia. Fred died in the smallpox epidemic, and Sophia was left totally deaf. So did all 60 Indians listed by Turner move to the Klamath Reservation? No. The 1870 census here shows Bessie living near Ed Langley and his mining partner, Mark Watkins, who was also from England. Ed and Bessie married the following year. Remember Charles Williams? He too had married an Indigenous woman, but was a widower by 1870 with a 6-year-old daughter. Perhaps the mother was one of the 3 Native women recorded to have died of smallpox. Charles himself had been confined to the pest house. Bessie's daughter, Sophia, here, married Freeman Oscar Collings, who had come to Jackson County from Indiana in 1852. And Ed's daughter, Martha, married his mining partner, Mark Watkins. And what of Celia, who had survived the Rogue Indian Wars, avoided removal to the Coast Reservation, survived the smallpox epidemic, and again avoided removal to the Klamath Reservation? She married Sylvester Arrowsmith, whose brother Ira was married to Nancy, a Takelma woman of some renown. in Jackson County. There's Celia. There is her sister, Suzanne, with George Marshall. In the 1870s, Bessie, Sophia, Martha, and Celia left Kanaka Flat and Forest Creek with their husbands. They moved to Big Applegate, and so did Charles William and his daughter, Madonna. Here is Sophia, Martha, with two of her daughters. Her son, Frank, we'll talk a lot more about him. Zebulon. Here's Celia with William and Lulu. This is Sophia's son, John. And this is Martha's firstborn, Mark Watkins. The families grew. Billy Dorn, the 1852 prospector, married Ann Horn. Their first child, David, was born in the then brand new United States Hotel in 1878. More families moved in: McLaren, Byrne, Haar. The community needed a school. Here's their one-room schoolhouse built by Watkins, Langley, Aerosmith by hand. And their first student body, Albert Collings. That's Sophia's firstborn. Here are some Aerosmith sisters. That's William Aerosmith, Celia's son. These boys down here are Collings. These are McLaren children also. Just a little side note. William McLaren owned the mining claim ultimately purchased by Deb McKee just before they put the county road all the way from Jacksonville up to the Blue Ledge mine. It was a mid-stop when they finally started running a stagecoach. So his was the stagecoach stop. And you know where that is now. That's the location of McKee Bridge. Here is the Watkins student body in 1906. Oscar Collings, Arnold family, Walter Collings, 1910. A region was commonly known by its post office. For years, Big Applegate was part of Wright, as in Nicholas Wright's store 5 miles downstream. Now, when the families first moved to Big Applegate, we know that Mark Watkins pretty promptly opened a miner's store, 1874, 1875. There were no roads up there when the county first surveyed and approved a road to get all the way to Big Applegate. The surveyor said, and it's going to stop opposite Mark Watkins' store. So he already did have a store. The road stopped on the wrong side of the river. People still had to ford the river or get across somehow to get to the store. So Mark Watkins applied for a post office in 1893. The office was in this shed, marked with an X, which I believe was also the store. The physical post office would drift from the ranch of one postmaster to the next. So Watkins had a good number of female postmasters. This was the separate post office run by Katie Byrne. Louise Haar and her daughter Grace were also postmasters. Maud Haar was a teacher. She graduated high school. She must have been sent to board in Jacksonville, graduated high school there by the time she was 17, attended normal school in Ashland, and was back up at Watkins. She'd get on her horse, ride up and over Collings Mountain to Steamboat to teach the Cooley children there when she was only 19 years old to start. Many of the students were older than she. That's the trail where you'll now find the Bigfoot trap. And this is one of her students, Ned Cooley, good student. He's reporting that he's about to go to the normal school. What was ranching like? This is branding on the Burn Ranch. We can pretty well find this exact location now. If you go to the Payette Manzanita Trail up on the east end of Applegate Lake, and it's a nice even trail. It's probably the remnants of an old ditch, so it's quite level. And you'll come to a big boggy area suddenly and say, hey, there's a spring there. Ta-da! That's where the Burn Ranch was. They piped into that spring and ran the water down. And we found a few other relics there. Here's Ed Langley's ranch, Watkins in the background. You're looking south, pretty much directly south here. So in the background, these would be the Red Buttes, the Red Butte Wilderness. This is Mary Collings, Frank Collings' wife at the Watkins, but she's at the Watkins Ranch, yes. And she came from England, so note the corgi, that makes sense. And it was hard work way up there. So that's haying on the Watkins Ranch. And hunting, of course. Here is about 1915 at the Fur Glade Gold Mine. Ezra and Jim Arnold. This is Zeb and Frank Collings. So these are Sophia's sons. Zeb was quite tall, probably about 6'4". Fred Bennett is the stepson of Ezra Arnold. And this here is William Garrett. He really was more associated with the Sterling Creek mine. His son Ralph was twice elected sheriff of Jackson County. He was first elected in 1916 and then resigned to go fight in World War I. Came back, was in the height of all the bootlegging problems, and was able to be reelected to regain his seat. So we're talking politics. What were the politics of these Big Applegaters? Many were populists and pacifists. This is the socialist group in 1916. Note that the women were suffragist white, even though here in Oregon, women had finally earned the vote, but that wasn't true yet nationwide. David Dorn was the registrar for the World War I draft and liberally recorded grounds for exemptions. For example, Oscar Collings here, his registration said conscientious objector status. Conscientious objector status. Thank you. I'll get that out. There's Frank again. He gets in so many photos. Zebulon here, Mary. Yeah, so those are some of the children of Sophia. Katie Byrne and Louise Haar. Those were two of those postmasters. And then Grace, Louise's daughter, who's now married, her son. And this is Christine Beaver, who was from Ashland and came up as a teacher at the Watkins School, fell in love and married Bert Haar. This is their son, John Haar. So despite having that ground for exemption in his draft registration, Oscar Collings, the youngest of Sophia's 8 children, did go off to war with Jim Arnold here when actually called up. They caught the train from Medford to boot camp up in Washington. Oscar was shipped to France, where he died of Spanish influenza just 5 weeks before armistice. And it took over 2.5 years to have his body returned for burial at Jacksonville, which is interesting, in Jacksonville, a place his mother was not allowed to enter. And here is John Haar, Lieutenant John Haar, freed after 18 months in POW Camp Staloff Luft No. 1 after he parachuted from his disabled B-17 Flying Fortress bomber. John returned to Jackson County, became a high school teacher, founder of the Flying Club, and master of the Upper Applegate Grange. Guy Watkins Martha's grandson, Ed's great-grandson, also flew bombers in World War II, then went to work and ultimately owned the copper store. Now, you may have heard that, oh, there was a little town called Copper in this area of Big Applegate. Not really a separate town. That's another one of those examples where a place takes the name of its post office. Copper had originally been a post office across the state line on Elliott Creek. And in the 20s, Martha's daughter, Mamie, had married Jim Winninghand, and they built a little store and took over and moved the post office. And that's so Copper moved, but it was really more in that general vicinity of Watkins. This is Frank Mengoz, a Civil War veteran. He lived to age 106. And here is Frank with the Byrne family. And we have Evelyn Byrne Williams' oil painting of this log home here on display. So Evelyn is the founder of McKee Bridge Historical Society. So she's descended from the Byrnes here. Her mother, her great-grandmother, Katie Byrne, that postmaster, is said to be the first white child ever born in Downeyville, California. And on the other side of her family, she's a McKee, the McKee family that came with Roxanne Hutchinson Hughes Bowen and John McKee and so on in 1853. And they staked their first homesteads on the base of that mountain that we still call Roxanne. And then I brought another piece by Evelyn, and that would have been Christine and Bert Haar's ranch looking up the Applegate River towards the Red Butte Wilderness. You know, it gives you some idea of how colorful things were, since all I have are black and white photos here. Of course, no one gave up mining. Ezra Arnold, Jim Johnson, soon to become his, well, he was his brother-in-law, Jim. The Terry brothers, they came in the 1880s after selling their lucrative claims in California. Steve Terry had served in the Nevada Guard during the Civil War. His younger brother, Jim Terry, Jim here, well, they told the story that they sailed around the Horn together to San Francisco, and they really didn't want to talk about that much more. In fact, Jim had been convicted of forgery, imprisoned in Pennsylvania, paroled on the condition he enlist for the Union, and he went AWOL. Yeah, it's like he's been caught up with his brother Steve, who had a farm down in Humboldt County by that time. So Jim partnered with Ed Langley. Here's Martha's father, Ed Langley, the one who managed the pest house. They developed lines up what we now call TL Creek. They had a 3-stamp mill, and it appears they did quite well with mining. As for recreation, Big Applegate had very talented baseball teams. There's Frank again, Oscar, Zeb. This is Bob Watkins. That would be Martha's 6th child, I think. John Byrne. This is the father of Evelyn Byrne Williams. These are also some McKee relatives here. They would go all the way down to Jacksonville when the area of raised foods was a baseball lot, and most of the reports are that they won. So out-of-town team won. Okay, so here's somebody who has a very interesting career. Sophia's son, George Francis. He went by Frank, left home at 16 for the Bay Area to box professionally as Battling Frankie Edwards. In the newspaper quite a bit. Now, I cannot totally vouch for this record that comes off the internet, but I would say I've been able to find some kind of newspaper record for 80% of those fights. And this looks pretty valid in terms of how many professional fights, how many he won by knockouts. Here would be Frank around in his late 90s. He lived to age 102. So how did he come up with that name, Battling Frankie Edwards? Perhaps borrowed from dashing Englishman Frank Edwards here. Frank married Martha's daughter, Minnie, and ran the store on Elliott Creek. He did sign up for the baseball team. Maybe he was good at cricket and made a quick conversion. We see him in a lot of our baseball pictures. So Frank was the major supplier to the Blue Ledge mine. Here he is in this photo with Bruce Dorn, a group of folks up at the Blue Ledge copper mine. Those are some miners at the top of portal number 1. Very rugged, remote country, and it's now a Superfund site. Has been so for about 15 years.
About what year is the photo?
It would probably be, the heyday of the mine was during World War I and just very briefly. So I'm going to say most likely 1917. They started to develop the mine seriously in 1904-05, but the transportation situation did not make it economical. So they just stockpiled all of the ore, which now we know once that weathers and it's subjected to a lot of rain causes acid mine drainage, which is the problem there. But with the outbreak of World War I, copper prices shot way up. And for the first time, it made sense for them to try and cart out commercial amounts of that ore. They had put in a continual road in 1906 from Jacksonville, taking out what were previously fords of the Applegate River, up and over a cliffside called Dead Horse Hill, where they actually cantilevered the road on this cliffside to get up to the mine. And so they started to bring wagon loads of ore out in December of 1916, 4-horse teams pulling these big, massive wagons on this narrow road along a cliff. And there was no way for a team coming from one end to know that the other was coming from the other. So I can only imagine how many mishaps they had. Their solution was to build McKee Bridge to cut out the Dead Horse Hill part. So that's why McKee Bridge was built in 1917. But then the war, ended not long after that, and the mine pretty much went back into mothballs. A few little spurts to try and drag some more out, but it was always going to be the greatest thing, so famous, like our local anaconda, but it was really quite a loser proposition. A pretty country up there. Okay, here's another big Applegator with an interesting career. Steve Reeves, Mr. Universe, star of Italian Westerns, the owner of Suncrest Ranch. Okay. What happened when someone in Watkins died? There were family cemeteries on the Watkins and Collins ranches, family plots at Logtown Cemetery, and some, like Sophia, buried their dead in Jacksonville. Celia and Bess Aerosmith's beautiful daughters all died tragically young. Their elegant grave markers here, side by side at Jacksonville. Here is an homage to Celia by her neighbor, that teacher, Christine Haar. Mrs. Aerosmith was a gentlewoman who wore a tattoo of 111 on her chin. She was a kind and accommodating neighbor whose services as midwife were much valued. She had a sweet sense of humor, and I am proud to have had the privilege to know her. So we have some records of those who were buried at Jacksonville. At Logtown, we've made an effort to reconstruct records after the fact, since really no records were kept before 1939. But what about the unmarked graves on the ranches? After the floods of 1964, the fever to build a dam spiked. The federal government bought out the ranches and raised the forests. Well, they had to resort to eminent domain with Guy Watkins. The real estate staff with the Corps of Engineers got ahead of the cultural resource folks. Based on interviews with people like Guy Watkins, Frank Collins here, and Grace Haar, the Corps contracted in advance to have the bodies they predicted would be dug up moved to the Jacksonville and Logtown cemeteries. And the Corps ordered the grave markers months before the archaeologists reported their actual findings. So at Jacksonville, we have the grave of Little Ben, someone who Grace Harr insisted was Frank Collings' imaginary orphan friend and never existed. A government-issued grave marker. 8 graves were placed at Logtown, and there is no evidence that 2 of the markers there, John Doe and Jane Doe, ever existed. The scant remains found could be stillborn children or maybe pets. This is an interpretive panel that McKeith Ridge Historical Society has installed at that plot that tells the story of those people and a bit more. Bessie, the Shasta, who raised Martha. Now, Martha was a Takelma, and the census used to ask for someone's mother tongue. Martha said Shasta, the language of her stepmother. So that's interesting. Bessie taught Martha Shasta. So Bessie had died in 1888, and they did identify her grave. And this is the receipt. The federal government paid $10 for her gravesite at Logtown Cemetery. Mark Watkins died in 1901. Martha married her son's brother-in-law, Mark Winningham, a widower who was related to the McKees. This is their home on Cougar Creek. That's going to be the far south end of what we call Applegate Reservoir now. Martha died in 1943 at age 83 and is buried at Jacksonville Cemetery. Sophia lived to age 90. Ed Langley left her his homestead. When Southern Oregon Historical Society recorded Frank's oral history, Frank insisted on singing a song that was taught to him by Ed Langley, his grandfather. Think about singing this to the tune of Auld Lang Syne. Old Grimes O'Lan, that good old man, he was between 9 and 10 feet high. He could wade the mouth of any creek and keep his shirt tail dry. Old Grimes' wife made butter and cheese, while Grimes, he drank the whey. There came a north wind from the south and blowed old Grimes away. So we have an Old English ditty that was passed down to the son of a Takelma and recorded right here in Jackson County. Celia and Vess moved to Siskiyou County in the early 1900s. Their sole surviving child, William, married a Yurok woman and lived on the Klamath Reservation. Celia died in Wairika in 1915, and she's buried at Evergreen Cemetery in an unmarked grave. And here's how their home, Big Applegate, looks now.
With the recent drought, the lake's empty.
Well, this wasn't literally today, as in like modern time. How's that?
But it's in the last 4 or 5 years.
Yes.
Yeah.
Oh, yes. Yeah, we had some very dry years. Here is the old county road. You can see when it's down. So the school would have been up in here, and that copper store a bit farther down on that east side of the river. This would have all just been lush riverbed before this. That's pretty much the view from the Byrne homestead, pretty much. And sometimes it does look like this. Yeah. Right. So there it is, Big Applegate, now known as Applegate Reservoir. Oh, thank you.